Okay,
Perfect.
we are live.
Welcome everyone to the new episode of AI co-learning program. I'm your host Bruce, and I'm delighted to have you all with us today. Today's topic is one that is becoming increasingly urgent: governance for LLMs and AI agents. So, with the rapid rise of autonomous and adaptive AI systems, questions of oversight, accountability, and shared governance are at the center of the global conversation. So today we're honored to welcome Sabina Non, a researcher from Stanford University. Her work focuses on AI agent governance, AI safety, and technology ethics. She has been a strong advocate for shared governance, emphasizing that effective AI governance requires collaborations across norms, organizations, and system design. So, hi, Sabina. We're thrilled to have you with us today. Thank you for joining the co-learning series. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for introducing me, and thank you so much for everyone for having me. My name is Sabina Non. I recently graduated from Stanford with a degree of Master's of Arts in International Policy, and I'll be soon joining the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence as a researcher. My work in the field of AI has basically primarily centered around responsible AI policy and also governance strategies from technical, governmental, and societal perspectives. I've worked on issues such as compute equity for emerging markets like India, comparative regulatory approaches to generative AI across key jurisdictions, and also contextualizing privacy principles in conversational AI tools. And having the experience of collaborating with a lot of the really passionate and smart people from all across the disciplines, my work has informed policymakers across the sectors from civil society organizations and also to government agencies, including GIZ and also the advisory team for President Emmanuel Macron. As AI models have become more advanced, and as we've introduced more layers of autonomy into these systems, I personally have become increasingly interested in the governance of agentic AI. And I think researchers and also practitioners all have their own different definitions. But we can broadly conceptualize it as AI moving towards a future where it has, first of all, persistence of memory. And second of all, it demonstrates more complex reasoning capabilities and also more decision making capabilities. And third, it gains a greater authority to interact directly with the digital and also the physical environments through access to a wide array of tools. And this makes it significantly different from the chatbot models that dominated the landscape since late 2022. We're moving from this static question answer systems to more adaptive and also go seeking agents that act on our behalf. Now, before we get into the nitty gritty of how to govern AI agents safely and responsibly, it is useful as a thought experiment to really step back and ask, for the last generation of AI models and also applications, what did we already do to make sure that they serve their intended purposes without causing harm? I have this little question for you, basically what it means for an AI systems to be safe. By reflecting on these safeguards from these different personas, we can see more clearly how and why AI agents diverge from earlier systems and what governance frameworks they would require. So basically right here, I've listed three different perspectives of developers, of government, and of citizens. Imagine if you're a developer. Safety usually means the technical reliability. And what does that mean? Does the system perform as expected? Does it minimize the bugs? Does it avoid catastrophic failure from internal design? An analogy that I usually resort to is an aircraft engineer, and your job is basically to make sure that the airplane is going to fly safely while operating. It is about the structural soundness, it is about the stress testing, and it is about the continuous processes of monitoring the operation. And if you are a government representative, what does safety means for you in terms of, and what does safety means for you? It means setting the rules to protect both the public and also prevent systematic risk. Going back to the aircraft example, governments don't focus on just one aircraft. It zooms out and really have this overview bird view of the entire system, including when aircrafts are interacting with each other, and also when the ecosystems of the parties that build, that deploy, and also that use these different aircrafts are interacting with each other. And thirdly, the perspectives of a citizen. Safety for a citizen, for a normal user, is definitely a much more personal perspective. It is about trusting the thing that you're using. It is about fairness of application and whether the technology feels safe to use in your daily life and daily operation. If we asked each of these groups for an answer on what does it mean for an AI system to be safe, I imagine that the developers might say safety here means reducing the biases, making sure that the model doesn't break down during operation. It also doesn't hallucinate dangerously to provide unsafe results and outputs. The government agencies might respond in this way. Safety means preventing harms to political stability. It means protecting privacy. It means ensuring compliance with regulations that serve the very particular national security as the government agencies would define it. And last but not least, the citizens might say, safety means that I trust personally the system with my sensitive information and interactions, and it won't exploit or mislead me in the ways that would cause harm to either my personal safety or my property safety. So what we're trying to get here is that safety doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. And for each stakeholders, it means something a little different. For developers, it's technical reliability. For governments, it's about the entire system. It's about protecting the entire system from being exploited by malicious actors and from internal hallucinations. And for citizens, it's about everyday trust during every single sessions of interactions. And no single perspectives would capture the entire picture. So what does this mean in real life governance structure? Safe AI systems require shared governance. And as Bruce has introduced me as an advocate for shared governance in my entire career, I think the reason for me behind all the costs that I have been pursuing is quite simple. It is basically that no single group can ensure safety on its own. Here I listed two really interesting paper and research where they talk about how governance is shared. The first paper is by Montemaki and the co-authors, where they show the AI governance structure follows this both top-down and also bottom-up flow at three interconnected levels. At the top, we see the environmental level, where we have hard laws, where we have broad social norms, and we have ethical principles. These are the meta ideas that include, for example, concepts like fairness, anti-discrimination, transparency, human dignity. And on the second level, we have organizational level. This is where you see organizations and also institutions such as companies and also standard bodies that translate the norms on the first level into policy frameworks and audit systems and enforcement mechanisms, and really inform what the developers on the next level can actually act out upon. And on the base level, we see the system design itself. This is where we see all of these principles, all of these like strategies that are designed by organizations, by governments, and also by social norms actually translate into technical safeguards and also administrative safeguards, where we can see how the models are being trained, how the models are being tested, and also how the models are going to be deployed. Here, each layer matters. If the norms aren't clear, organizations can't really enforce them. And if the strategies where the organizations have designed don't act, then system designers won't prioritize safeguards in a practical term. And if the design isn't robust, norms and policies don't really matter in practice. They are basically just the yard in the air. And on the right, we can see another really interesting shared governance framework that is proposed by Chan and the co-authors, where they proposed a multilateral governance level that spanning across three different stakeholder groups. Here we see citizens, we see corporations, and we see governments that are usually at the center of debate for every safety discussions. And you can see that this governance framework really requires both shared responsibility and also shared trust across these different stakeholders. And here, shared trust is based on how these stakeholders would demonstrate certain elements during their interactions, where you can see, for example, competence, where you can see integrity, and where you can see benevolence. For example, for governance, capabilities for designing and also enforcing standards for safety and accountability builds the foundation for competence to be trusted by other stakeholders. And that's where they can flow this mechanisms of trust and responsibilities within these different actors when there are creating a shared standard for enforcing what safety would mean for a model. Now that we've established why safe AI requires shared governance, the next step naturally is to know what we're governing against. I think one of the questions that really befuddles me when I entered the space in the first space was, how do we comprehensively prepare for all of the potential risks, and how can we take advantage of the shared governance to combat their negative influences? Simply just because there are so many risks out there, and what is a really good systematic way of mapping them out? And there are a few strategies and mechanisms that I find to be particularly useful. And the first way is to systematically map AI risks to look at them in concrete terms. What does it mean? Every risk has a cause, where it comes from. And also every risk has an impact, how it shows up in the world with the real world impact. On the cause side, we simply need to ask three different questions: the who, the why, and the when. Who is responsible? Is it the AI? Is it the human? Or is it the interaction between these different actors? Why did the risk occur? Was it because of intentional misuse, or was it because of unintentional design flaws? When does it arise? Did it arise before deployment or after the system has already scaled? And on the impact side, risks really manifest into social consequences that interact with the existing socio-political economic systems. These can look like biases and discrimination, misinformation, cybersecurity vulnerabilities, or erosion of democratic trust, where you can see more categories listed on this slide. And with different sets of cause and impact, we will require different interventions. Let me give you two examples that I think will help you understand what I mean by mapping risks from causes to impact. For example, one of the really often cited examples of the risks within AI is deepfakes in elections. When we look at how the risks really play out and asking who is responsible for it, it's usually a malicious human actor that is coming from outside of the AI development cycle. And the why is usually intentional. It's to manipulate public opinion with the use of the synthetic piece of media. And the when usually occurs after deployment, because a generative model that was made widely accessible should be repurposed without safeguards and then be misused by this malicious human actor. And the impact, the result, is misinformation at scale. Videos and also audio clips that appear authentic, which undermines public trust in democratic institutions and also candidates, and destabilizes electoral processes. And to think about the mitigation processes for this very particular example, because the cause is a malicious human actor after deployment, interventions really should focus on accountability for the human misuse cases. And that would mean something like content monitoring, mandatory labeling of synthetic data, watermarks, rapid takedown protocols, and also legal consequences that can be attributed to the human actor for bad actors. The focus is really less about redesigning the model itself and more on governing the human misuse at scale. And another example, which is very different from what we've just talked about in terms of deepfakes, is AI that is used in hiring processes. And here, the who is usually the AI model itself that is interacting with, for example, bias training data provided by humans. And the why is usually unintentional. The system reproduces patterns of discrimination that is embedded in historical resumes and also human selection processes. The when is after deployment, as the bias becomes evident when real applicants are evaluated through the models. The outcome is discriminatory hiring practices that perpetuates inequality in access to jobs and reinforce systematic exclusion of certain demographic groups. The mitigation process that we see here is going to be very, very different from what we've just talked about in deepfakes, because the cause is AI's unintentional behavior instead of a human actor's malicious intention. And it's also considered to be, and also the risk is considered to be before the deployment, because it arises from the interactions of the model with the discriminatory and the bias training data. So interventions in this case should really focus on correcting the system itself. This means, for example, stronger data governance, This would mean bias audits, transparency requirements, explainability tool to ensure that decisions can be scrutinized. The focus here really is on technical and organizational and also design fixes before harm spread further. I think really like putting these two examples in parallel show how causes and impacts are really connected. If we don't analyze both sides, we risk really either treating only the symptoms or ignoring how risks emerge in the first place. And of course, not all risks are the same. There's another way that I think is also really interesting for us to map out systematically where risk exists within AI systems. So when we evaluate risk, we can think about it as a very simple equation. Risk equals to likelihood and impact. This is a really simple, really simple equation and helps us distinguish between different types of risks. For example, in the graph that I'm showing here, I put major risks on highly likely and catastrophic impact, and I put negligible risk on the rarely happening and also negligible impact. And this can show how we actually prioritize where and when and how we start to prioritize which risks that we target in order to make sure that resources are effectively and efficiently being utilized. So, for example, some of the high likelihood and also for example, let me give you an example of something that will happen in the major risk category, and also something that will be happening in the negligible risk category. So, for example, something that is highly likely but is also giving catastrophic impact will be happening in terms of more discriminatory practices that are going to be given by AI models in terms of public service delivery. Because public service delivery is a field of critical importance, and it's basically affecting a huge number of citizens and also groups across the country and across the globe, it is going to cause many people, for example, risk losing their health insurances and therefore suffering from potential livelihood risks. And at the same time, it is going to be pretty highly likely in the sense that the systems are more likely to suffer from discriminatory and biased training sets. And some of the other high likelihood but also low impact cases would include, for example, spam generated by chatbots. They're annoying, they're widespread, but at the same time, they're not catastrophic. And some of the examples of more low likelihood but also high impact cases would be, for example, a rogue financial trading agent that crashes market or an AI systems that disrupts critical infrastructure. They're potentially not going to be happening every single day, but they can cause real catastrophic impact on the livelihood of human beings. And I think what is important about this framework is that it helps us prioritize the government's efforts. If we spend all of our time, for example, on just targeting spam generated by chatbots, we'd ignore existential risks. But if we only focus on catastrophic scenarios, we might miss the harms people actually face every single day. This is also a reminder that a risk is very dynamic. When we're looking at the likelihood and also the impact right now, they're not just static numbers that are going to be given at any point in history. A risk that is very rare today, like an AI-enabled cyber attack on power grids, could become much more likely as technology proliferates. So once we understand a little bit more about where do risks exist, I think it's really important for now to think about what can we actually do to mitigate them. That brings us to technical interventions across the AI lifecycle. One of the things that I think a lot of the developer audience right now that is listening will be very familiar is called security by design. And what does this mean is that risks are not inevitable. There are many things that we can do throughout the AI development lifecycle, from design to deployment and also to the post-deployment monitoring, that we can do to actually mitigate a lot of the risks that we've just mentioned. For example, in the design and training stage, we can use data governance practices to ensure quality and representation. We can apply bias detection and mitigation methods. We can explore alignment methods like reinforcement learning from human feedback or constitutional AI. And during a testing stage, there's a lot of different mechanisms that we see, for example, that are widely adopted, such as red teaming efforts, robustness checks, fairness audits, and also explainability tools. And during the deployment stage, and also the post-deployment safeguards, we see, for example, policy and filtering stacks to prevent harmful outputs. We see access restrictions for certain users, so dangerous capabilities aren't available to anyone with an internet connection. And we also see transparency disclosures where we can help users to understand capabilities and limits, especially useful for users that aren't particularly familiar with what the systems can do and can potentially generate harm in ways that are unexpected. And also in terms of post-deployment monitoring, there's a lot of things including like track usage patterns, detect anomalies, and also keep updating systems. And just like in cybersecurity, governance doesn't end at launch. It is the old school handbook style of continuous vigilance. And the lesson is safety isn't just a single checkpoint. It is something that requires a life cycle of interventions that work together. And this also ties back to the shared governance perspective that we were talking about. It really requires not just one single system, not just one single stakeholder, and not just one single set of norms to really make sure that the systems act as expected and also in the safe way that we will ensure long-term compliance with human benefits. It really requires joint efforts from different stakeholders, from different perspectives, and also throughout this life cycle of development and also deployment. But also, even with all of these mitigations, we face a bigger challenge within the systematic landscape. And what is this? AI doesn't just exist in one unified socio, technical, and also political system. Global AI governance remains very fragmented across jurisdictions, and that fragmentation makes risk mitigation much harder. What does it mean? I think I am going to give you 3 examples of what currently key jurisdictions across the globe are targeting the issue. For example, let's begin with Europe, which has probably gone the furthest in codifying AI governance and also has carried out the enforcement just this month. So the EU's main framework is called the EU AI Act, finalized in 2024, which takes a risk-based approach, which you can see in the little graph that I've shown here. What does this mean is that the rules depend really on how risky that the EU regulatory system approach and assess the system to be. It divides the system into 4 different categories of risk, including unacceptable risk, high risk, limited risk, and also minimal risks. And according to each of these different risk cycles, certain regulatory approaches are being applied to each system. For example, unacceptable risk systems are prohibited. For example, like social scoring systems or manipulative AI that target vulnerable groups are going to be not allowed with in terms of both development and also deployment within the EU. And for example, high-risk systems like AI used in hiring, healthcare, law enforcement, or essential infrastructure are going to be subject to strict requirements before they can be deployed. And this also include measures such as risk assessments, conformity checks, and also documentation. And for systems that are not considered to be super high risk and are considered to be limited risk systems like chatbots, they must meet certain transparency obligations, such as informing users when they're interacting with the AI. And meanwhile, for systems that are considered to be minimal risks, like spam filters, they have very few requirements as they're already being deployed with a long history, and they haven't really been encountering a lot of the risks. This tiered approach is meant to balance innovation and also safety. It allows lower risk applications to flourish while heavily scrutinizing high stakes systems. What's new, particularly in 2025, is that enforcement is no longer theoretical. It has really begun. For example, as of August 2nd, 2025, which is just a few weeks ago, the EU AI office is operational. It is responsible for overseeing general purpose AI models across the bloc, while an AI board made up of member state representatives coordinates the national enforcements across the different member states within the EU. And at the same time, each member state, have had to designate their national AI authorities, at least one for market surveillance and one for certifications, to ensure that enforcement doesn't just sit in Brussels, but also happens locally in every context that are very different from each other. And for example, providers of general purpose AI models must now comply with obligations around transparency, documentation, and copyright. Existing models on the market have a grace period until 2027 to become fully compliant, but all of this story combined is to say that this is probably one of the most comprehensive AI Act that we have across jurisdictions right now, and it's been in effect. And the next really, really interesting example is going to be the US, which is very different from what the EU has been taking in terms of approach. It has largely focused on innovation, which means that the regulation is going to be very limited, and it's going to be very high level meta, but at the same time, it's not going to have very strict regulatory approaches to different systems. For example, within this slide, you can see this is the NIST principles for what a safe AI system should look like. And it has introduces a lot of the principle-based approaches, including that the AI system has to be safe, secure and resilient, explainable and interpretable, privacy enhanced, fair with harmful bias managed, valid and reliable, and also accountable and transparent across the spectrum. And you can see that this is actually very different from what we see within the EU AI Act, because it doesn't really tell you what thresholds of approaches that we're going to introduce for different AI models. And instead, it is just going to tell you that we are a market that really respects innovation, and we are going to prioritize innovation over regulations that is going to pose restrictive manners towards these different AI models. And lastly, we're going to talk about China, which is a very interesting example that kind of sits in between the US and also the EU model. It has been a first mover in creating a lot of the AI specific regulations, specifically in iterative and very vertical application domains, starting earlier than both the EU and the US. It has been very much application focused, rolling out targeted regulations for different types of AI. For example, within 2021, China issued rules for recommendation algorithms, requiring companies to give users more control for how algorithms influence what they see. In 2022, it issued rules for deep synthesis technologies. In 2023, a more comprehensive regulation for generative AI was introduced, and it emphasized truthfulness, data legality, security reviews, and among other security measures. And providers must register their models with regulators before public deployment. And alongside these rules, TC 260, which is the Technical Committee on Standardization, issued enforcement safety standards. And these standards serve as a practical baseline detailing how providers should have handled data quality, model evaluation, and the risk management in more practical and technical terms. And in other words, it's not just regulation on paper, but it's backed by standards that companies must operationalize before their systems go live. So how does the China's approach compare, for example, to the EU and also to the US? Like the EU, it uses legal obligations backed by enforcement. And like the US, it is a little more pragmatic in the sense that it focuses on concrete applications and sectorial issues rather than one comprehensive law. Its distinctive feature, though, is the emphasis on registration and government control over what accountability would actually look like. Now, when we put Europe, US, and also China side by side, we see why AI governance right now is very fragmented on a global scale, particularly in the core principles each jurisdiction's anchor its AI governance in. For example, in the European Union, when we look at how they actually define the different four categories of the risks, rules are really grounded in fundamental rights. It ensures fairness, transparency, and human dignity, principles that are more flashed out in human rights into the way of how they really designate what systems would pose more risks to human beings. Within the United States, the emphasis is more on innovation and competition. Fairness and privacy are acknowledged within laws, but they're often secondary to keeping a flexible and pro-innovation environment. And lastly, in China, regulations prioritize security, truthfulness, and alignment with broader governance objectives, with requirements like registration and also content accuracy and content control. The result is that what counts as a safe or responsible AI systems would look very different depending on where the system is. It depends on where the developers are. It depends on where the public deployment is going to showcase towards. In Europe, it's about rights. In the US, it's about innovation. In China, it's about security and sociopolitical stability. Without a really comprehensive shared baseline, global coordination in terms of regulating the models are going to be extremely challenging. Up until now, we've been talking about AI governance in a more broader sense, but I think what makes an AI agent different from past systems and why do they require a unique governance lens is something that would that really attract a lot of attention recently. Think of it this way. Traditional AI tools are like more reactive and bounded. They take input, they give you output, and then they stop there. AI agents, on a contrast, they're more adaptive and goal-seeking. This means, as I've defined from the beginning, means that they can plan, they can remember past interactions, they can remember all of the feedback that you have given them, and they can act across digital and also physical environments with the tools that they have access to. And even more, when multiple agents interact with each other, we get these collective systems with emergent behaviors, outcomes no one really fully intended or designed, and at the same time not even understand. And this creates what's called the principal agent problem, which I think it's a really good framework to understand this issue. In economics, this issue is that when an agent, like an employee, might not always act in the best interest of the principal, which is the employer. And with AI agents, the problem becomes more amplified in the sense that we have information asymmetry, where the agent knows more about its internal reasoning than humans can observe. And we see discretionary authority where agents can make decisions autonomously in real time. And we also observe these loyalty gaps where agents' optimization goals may diverge from what the humans really wants. And I'm going to give a concrete example, which I find it to be really important, and it's actually happening very frequently right now in real life, where you can see a customer service agent that is told to reduce call times. It can cut off users very quickly and undermining trust that is fundamental and also integral to what a business could rely on. And for example, a trading agent that is instructed to maximize short-term returns may take highly risky strategies that benefit the portfolio in the short run, but destabilize the entire market in the long run. And the problem is that the traditional governance tools that we are talking about, for example, incentives, for example, monitoring, for example, enforcement of the principles, don't really scale here because we can't supervise every single decision of a machine running at a digital speed. So the question becomes, how do we really rethink governance when dealing with agents that are more autonomous, more opaque, and more fast-moving? This takes us to the key governance priorities emerging in this space. A lot of the researchers, when they're talking about governing AI agents, 4 priorities consistently come up: alignment and loyalty, robustness and reliability, transparency and oversight, and also accountability. And each of these brackets, one overarching theme is that, like I've said, we cannot really necessarily monitor every single decisions that an AI agent is performing out, because that's simply not the reason why we're using them in the first place, because we want to scale and maximize our action efficiency. So, for example, in alignment and loyalty part, where we're trying to close the gap between the goals, most mechanisms for aligning AI agents remain experimental. Researchers have tried reinforcement learning to constitutional AI and to more novel incentive structure. But the central question remains the same. It's how do we ensure that the agent's goals stay loyal to human intent? And for example, in terms of robustness and reliability, I think this is where the industry has taken the most measures in and where it has proven to be more effective right now than other of the measures. For example, sandboxing of tool and environment access has been increasingly adopted by industry players, including ChatGPT and Manus AI. And in terms of transparency and oversight, research proposals have focused on increasing the visibility through, for example, agent identifiers, real-time monitoring, and logging as a foundational layer for governance. Although these tools are still, these tools really like emphasize the visibility, but at the same time, they're still very much remain in the research space and haven't really scaled in industry applications. And last but not least, recent research proposes extend existing identity and authorization standards and building decentralized protocols to embed accountability within. Oh, sorry. To embed accountability within AI agents ecosystem through agent-specific credentials, identity layers, registries, um, and also compliance mechanisms. And this is really just to ensure like who within the ecosystems are taking responsibilities when a decision and when a behavior is going wild. I wanted to really zoom in to look at one of the practices that has been adopted by many of the leading industry actors within a space, which is called sandboxing. And I just wanted to go through like what it is, what is its strength, and what kind of risks does this particular strategy really bring. So it is one of the most practical governance tools being tested today. And think of this as just putting an AI agent inside a controlled container or virtual environments. But they cannot really freely interact with external systems such as databases, APIs, financial tools, or the open internet unless explicitly permitted. And there are three different kinds of sandboxings or like major categories of sandboxing, including the container-based, virtual machine-based, and also custom sandboxes. And what are the strengths for these tools? First of all, it limits unintended damage by controlling the scope of how the agent can really interact and how they can access the tool. It also allows safety testing and monitoring before deployment. And it also provides a clear boundary between experimentation and also real world impact when we're carrying out a specific action. But at the same time, it also introduces risks within a realm. For example, it gives you a false sense of identity. A sandbox agent might behave safely inside, but when it goes outside, when it's actually interacting with the digital and also the physical environment, it might act very differently once given more freedom. And that, how can we control for that, is something to be carefully, is something that needs to be carefully considered. At the same time, it also requires higher resources, which means that maintaining parallel sandbox environments is relatively expensive. And it would mean that less players are going to be able to afford this when they're introducing these tools within the operation space. So that leads to a bigger question. Before we can define what good governance looks like, what foundational questions do we need to answer? We have some of the tools, we have some of the research proposals, but we don't yet have the answer to what constitutes a really, really good governance. Some of the foundational questions that I believe to be very important when we approach the space comes from two different brackets. And I call them the normative questions and operative questions. The normative questions really talks about values. Why do we govern? Is it for safety? Is it for trust? Is it for protecting the rights of humans and dignity? Is it for enabling innovation? For whom are we governing the AI models? Who is benefiting and who is most at risks? Is it citizens? Is it governance? Is it national security? Is it companies? Or is it the global society? Who decides and who enforces? Should we allow national regulators to take more initiatives? Should we allow industry to self-regulate, or should we allow international bodies to take a lot more proactive actions, or the mix of some of these different actors all at the same time? And which context and jurisdictions matters the most? We see a global distribution of technology innovators, but at the same time, there's also a lot of inequalities in terms of resources and also innovations that are happening across these different contexts. And do we apply the same rules for AI agents in healthcare, or do we like we do to AI agents, for example, in gaming. Like different industries would also require very different standards and rules. And that would also lead us to the operational questions. For example, what is being governed? Do we care more about the model? Do we care more about the outputs, the data, or the ecosystems of agents? When in the life cycle should interventions occur? For example, we talked about the entire AI development cycle. There are design, there are deployment, and they're also in real-time use in the monitoring processes. How do we govern? What are the mechanisms? What are the technical tools that we can introduce? What are the norms and market incentives that we can really introduce to make sure that the principles are going to be translated into strategies and then design principles? And at what scale? Should we focus on individual systems? Should we focus on the network of agents? Or should we focus on the entire ecosystems where we are also talking about players and not just the technical systems themselves? And once we start answering these questions, what are the pathways toward governing AI agents in the future? There's no definitive answer right now in this moment, and I don't believe anyone has. But I think that there are ways that we can start to improve how we really go forward to think about a more comprehensive framework. So I emphasize 4 brackets of governance opportunities and transparency and accountability, oversight and guardrails, strategic and global coordination, and also systematic risk and emergence. I believe like these are 4 major opportunities for governing AI agents, where, for example, we can see um, develop the systems where agents can have more clear identification, activity logs, and traceabilities so that we can actually observe what they have done and also go back to inspect a particular point in time when they have go wrong. And we can also build monitoring systems that operate in real time, flagging anomalies and also unsafe behaviors. We can also shift from focusing on individual AI systems to watching for emergent risks during interactions in networks of agents. And one spark might not matter, but multiple sparks in a dry forest create wildfire risks. And and also at the same time, I believe that within the current context that we're discussing, a lot of the times we've seen very separated and also very isolated discussions of what AI governance would look like in different national systems. But I believe that strategic and global coordinations would really matter here because this is a problem that is going to face all humanity. It doesn't really matter which country you are going to be at. You are going to be using very similar systems. And by sharing the socio-technical understandings of the underlying risks, it is going to be a very important it is going to be a very important framework where we can anticipate proliferation with forward-looking cooperative strategies and also foster alignment across jurisdictions. With that being said, this is all for my presentation. Just to recap, AI agents are different. Safe AI requires shared governance. We need to map risks by causes and impacts, and also by likelihood and risks. With all of the fragmentation across jurisdictions right now, we need to really focus on a path forward where we requires asking all of the foundational questions on the values, but also on the operations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sabina, for the inspiring talk. That was impressive. So now we're open the floor for questions from the audience. So please drop your questions in the live chat.
I see
So
the first
let's
question.
see. Yeah. The first question here we have here is currently AI governance often involves enterprises, governments, academic institutions, and open source communities. So how do you think the power and the responsibilities of these parties should be balanced?
I think this is a really, really good question. And I think I just wanted to go back to the slide where we were talking about earlier on the shared governance framework. And I think on an abstract level, where we say that governance requires shared trust and responsibilities among interconnected stakeholders, this basically means that you have to have a lot of trust that is interweaving the power and understandings between all of these different stakeholders, because each of these different stakeholders would have a piece of truth that are for them would represent what safety would mean for AI systems. Like for example, enterprises are at the front lines of observing not just the model development, but at the same time how model is being used and being interacting with real world users and also real world applications. And they would have a lot, and they would be they would have a lot of information on um, how that is going to cause a lot of the risks. And at the same time, they would have a lot of responsibilities of sharing that information with the rest of these stakeholders, including governments, including academic institutions, and including open source communities, because they are going to be at the forefront at the more rapid monitoring side. And for governments, they're at a very different level. They're on a more meta level of anticipating risks. There will be, for example, combining both what principles would look like for other safe technological systems would look like, and then combine these principles to what, and then apply these different principles to what it would mean for the AI space. And with that being said, um, they need to take more information from both enterprises, academic institutions, and open source communities for what real world applications of these principles would look like, and then adapt them for future adaptations. So I think this is really just how you can see there should be an interwoven web of trust, where you can see that different institutions and different stakeholders have their own observations and norms that they need to communicate very well with each other, and they need to act with good faith when they're interacting and when they're observing and when they're adapting towards each other's socio-technical norms.
Yeah, great. The next question is, when AI decisions cause harm, should responsibility fall on the model developers, deployers, or just model users?
I think this is a really good question, and I definitely don't have a definitive answer to it. I think it really
Hmm.
depends on the context. Um, for example, I think there needs for model developers, the responsibilities really lie upon you have to have efficient safeguards and also procedural safeguards that you need to both um, insert within an entire life cycle. That means you have to have good technical safeguards when you're developing the model. It means that you have to have enough safeguards when you're deploying the models, but at the same time you also and also at the same time you need to make sure that the model is going to be tested up like under stress testing environments to make sure that they have been doing all of the procedural um, they've been doing all the procedural measures to make sure that the model is going to be actively adapting to how humans are going to use them. And for deployers, you need to be really like the bridge between developers and users, because you are going to be collecting information from the user, how users are using the models, how they're interacting with the models, and at the same time you are going to be informing the model developers of that usage pattern, and at the same time you have to inform users how they should use the model in the first place. So it's really just like, I think it's a shared accountability framework where each of these different players and stakeholders would have their own piece of accountability that they have to carry on their shoulder. But at the same time, it really depends on the context and on how much safeguards that you have actually be introduced into the system to make sure that you're not actively neglecting something that you could have done but you haven't done.
Okay. The third question here is, if AI becomes highly autonomous and even capable of operating across borders in the future, um, will existing governance frameworks be sufficient? And if that's insufficient for now, how should we design long-term governance mechanisms?
Super good question again. I think even I think even within this context, like AI hasn't become highly autonomous and capable of operating across borders. Like even if it's not highly autonomous, it's still already operating across borders right now. And do we have a sufficient governance framework for it? I imagine that you are talking about existing governance within the like government jurisdictions legal sense. And I would say that the current legal framework and also just the legal norms and the jurisdiction and the cooperation norms across different jurisdictions are definitely not going to be sufficient. And I think in the future, the long-term governance frameworks and mechanisms should really um, be shared across different stakeholders that are going to be sitting in very different communities. Like, for example, right now we're talking a lot about the stakeholders within many leading economies, including the US, including Europe, and including China, just because there are a lot of developers and deployers that are sitting within these jurisdictions. but at the same time, we're ignoring a lot of the citizens and users' perspectives that are coming from certain countries that haven't really been included in these policy discussions and governance frameworks. And at the same time, I think even one more stakeholder that has been really overlooked in this entire process is, for example, stakeholders that are supplying the data for the development of these AI models, and how to incorporate that mechanisms and that discussions within the current governance frameworks that we've been talking about. I think it's more than important to ensure that we have something even to start thinking about long term, because this would mean like not just mapping out risks that we as we see it right now, but also just to include as much demographic and also as much communities as we can think about, that will be influenced and that has already been influenced in the long term.
Oh, great. The last question we have here is, as agents and their self-iteration capabilities grow, how can governors avoid the risk of running out of control?
I think this is a really good question, and I'm just scrolling my slide right now just to see where the governance opportunities are. I don't think anyone has an answer, especially for like all the emergent behaviors
Mhm.
that we observe from AI agents, especially from the networks of AI agents. um, when we say how can governance avoid the risk of running out of control, I think the most important part is just to have safety by design from start to final, and that would mean not introducing things that you are not sure is not going to work. I think robust all of the technical safeguards, all of the principles that we introduce are important to the point that they are helping us to gain educated guess. And that educated guess means we are going to have a certain thresholds for when we are confident and when we're comfortable releasing certain models and also releasing certain systems in interaction with the real world. And I think having that threshold to be set at a very high point when we have very low confidence and when we have very low certainty is going to be a very important governance choices, because it means that we need to have more transparency. It means we have to be more prepared. It means that we have to be more cautious against really rolling things that we don't understand how it works and how it's going to cause troubles.
Yeah, great. I think that brings us to the end of today's lecture. Huge thanks again to Sabina for sharing her expertise on how we govern LLMs and AI agents, which is one of the most important questions facing AI today. And again, we'll share the replay and slides through our community channels. Please stay tuned for our upcoming sessions. And until next time, keep questioning and keep co-learning with us. Bye. Bye, Sabina. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.